around the same time as Christmas decorations comes up in Scandinavian homes, you will start to see this little guy appearing everywhere. And I mean everywhere. He doesn't look like the red and white fat jolly Santa Claus that we normally see from the US, but he does bear some resemblance. For example, the red pointy hat and the beard. But from the beginning he has nothing to do with Santa Claus. He was neither a Santa Claus helper, nor was he just only connected to Yule or Christmas. The normal translation of this being into English is gnome. I use it all the time myself because it is an easy way to explain what kind of being I am talking about. And it does look a lot like a gnome. A gnome and a tomte is two separate beings though. So just translating tomte to gnome is a bit sloppy and lazy. I really shouldn't do that. A gnome is a being that seems to have its origins sometimes during the Renaissance in Poland or Germany. I have read both. Gnomes are a sort of elemental beings, earth-dwelling beings that is strongly connected to the element of earth. They later show up in modern days as our garden gnomes and have been very popular in all kinds of art. We also find very similar beings to the tomte in the Slavic domovoj or domovoj, sorry if I'm butchering that word. And then we have Hob in England, Brownie in Scotland, and the Heinzelmännchen in Germany. So this kind of protective house spirit seems to have many possible origins, and it's also more or less impossible to know which was the first one and which was borrowed from where, and if the Scandinavian tomte is a relative to either of them. But they do look a lot alike, and they also have very similar purpose, all of these kinds of house protection spirits. This is of course also a thing where, well, I've spoken about this a lot, I think almost all of my videos. Like most of our folklore, things change through time, and we start to picture the beings in different styles than they perhaps had from the beginning. So why we think they are so alike today might not always have been. But let's start from the beginning with this fellow. Tomten is probably very old. How old is impossible to say because we do not have much reference from pre-Christian era about him. But we do know that the church complained a lot about him, and that people put out food for him already during medieval times. And as usual, when someone is trying to make the people stop doing something, it's a good reference to what they actually was doing. Already during the medieval times, the church wrote warnings about this. Even the Swedish saint Birgitta from the 14th century writes at least on 2 places quite harsh words about how the common people refuses to give up their worship of this Tomta Gudi. Gudi meaning God and Tomta meaning Tomte. We do not know if the people really thought of the Tomte as a godly being. That I will leave unsaid. But for a hardcore Catholic as Holy Birgitta, their habit of putting out food for him must of course have been a clear offering to another god, something we all know that you should not do as a good Christian. No other gods than God, right? One of the first time we see him in any kind of painting is in Olaus Magnus' Historia de Gentibus Septentriobina his script printed in Rome 1555. Olaus Magnus is not a source to rely on for truth. First off, well, we have to take into the consideration that the beings might not have been described in the best light. He was a Catholic priest with a bishop's title after all. At the same time, he seems to love to tell good stories and everything that was true Scandinavian, and he mixed up ethnology, history and cartography with all kinds of tall tales, fairy tales and folklore. But In his script, there is a lot of drawn pictures of what is supposed to be both Scandinavian fairies, and also here we have tomtar. On this picture, they are drawn more like little devil spirit that helps the farmer in their daily work. This is far away from both the grumpy bearded old man and the more Christmassy gnome version that we see later in history. When he turned from the more devil-like creature to a grumpy old man is unclear, or if he perhaps was a grumpy old man from the beginning and is just drawn like this because the script was a Catholic script and therefore all these beings was a sort of tin gods or devil's henchmen. Later in history, we see him painted like the little bearded old man that people spoke about, small in stature, with brown or grey clothing, and with his characteristic pointy cap. The artist Jenny Nyberg in the late 19th century and early 20th century was later a big impact on how he was painted in more modern days, and probably also the cause that we started to picture the Tomte more in the same style as European gnomes. But regardless of his looks, this picture portrays how we have seen him throughout time, helping the farmer in his daily work. Tomten is, and always have been, a sort of house spirit, a protection spirit that gives the farm good fortune. He will help you with taking care of the animals, keep them healthy, and also making sure the barn was filled with hay and grain. Tomten is a bachelor. He is a single guy. He lives alone, usually said to live under the big tree in the garden, under the floor, in the barn, or up in the attic. He had a rather bad temper, he was easy to anger, and you needed to keep to his rules, and you needed to appease him with food and offerings, and perhaps a pair of good new mittens now and then. This was to keep him stay at your farm and be happy and comfy there. There are stories of farm boys that was swearing in the barn and suddenly something invisible slapped them so hard over the ear that they nearly lost their hearing.
Sometimes you have to slap them in the face just to get their attention.
There is also stories how the same happened to another young man that was not kind to the animals, especially the horses. Horses was Tomten's favorite animal, and he cared a lot about them. In the morning you could see so-called Tomte braids in the horse's mane, and that was thought to be on the horses that was Tomte's absolute favorite horse. Other rules than not swearing and being kind to animals was to keep the barn and stable clean and in good order. You should also not be up late dancing and singing, because then the Tomte get pissed off because you was too loud and you also hindered him from doing his job. He didn't like to be seen, so he preferred to work during the hours when the people at the farm slept. As said, from the start he was not just a being that showed up for Christmas. He was there all year round, but he was of course pleased that you gave him a bit of the good Yule food from the Yule table. And his absolute best treat was a big bowl of white sweet porridge, rice porridge or semolina porridge. In older days, people didn't eat this with milk as we tend to do today, and a very common way to eat porridge in households was to have it in a huge bowl in the middle of the table, and then you put a big chunk of butter in the middle that melted from the heat from the porridge. When you ate, you then dipped your spoon in the butter and ate from the edge. In Sweden there are still sayings like keep on your own edge, hålla sig på sin kant, or end up in the middle of the butter, hamna mitt i smöret, that comes from this habit. And of course, the Tomte wanted butter to his porridge too. If he didn't get that, he could be really angry. One of the tales around this is that there was a man that wanted to do a little joke with the Tomte. So he hid the butter under the porridge when he put out the bowl. When the Tomte couldn't see the butter, he got really angry, and with his bare hands he killed off one of the cows. Afterwards he decided to eat the porridge even if there was no butter, and then when he saw that there was actually butter, he got so regretful that he then dragged the dead cow to the neighbor's farm and took a live and healthy cow back, putting a hex on the dead cow so the neighbors would not realize that it had been changed. This story also shows up in the variation that the butter simply melted down to the bottom of the bowl. There is also a story that one of those funny farming working boys decided to eat all the porridge for himself and then instead took a huge dump in the bowl, leaving a load of crap, to be frank.
Slingrar! Nej, nu flyttar jag till granngården.
That made the Tomte so angry that he put the barn on fire and moved over to the neighbors for good instead. Well, can't say I blame him for leaving, even though perhaps burning down the farm was a bit overkill in my eyes. But you should never be impolite towards supernatural beings. This is a rule to keep almost about everything. Another story about this Tomte was when the farmer saw him carrying a small straw, huffing and puffing as one does when things are heavy. And the farmer taunted the Tomte and said, that was nothing to huff about. The Tomte got very pissed off about this and answered that if the farmer thought that this was nothing to huff about, this was the last time Tomten huffed for the farmer. And then the Tomte abandoned the farm and moved to the neighbors. This farmer got poor and miserable while he could see that his neighbor's farm thrived. Another thing worth mentioning, since I mentioned that you could give him other gifts than just a bowl of porridge. Yes, a pair of mittens or socks was a good gift, but you needed to be careful not to give him too pretty things. Then he could turn haughty and cocky and deem himself to be too pretty and too fancy for work. This is a very common tale spread all over Scandinavia about how a farmer that managed to get a glimpse of his Tomte feels sad because Tomten has such grey and torn clothing, and since the Tomte has served him so well during the years, he makes a complete new outfit for the Tomte. Tomten then says something like, fancy man, never will he get dust on himself again. And then he leaves the farm to go live out his new fancy life, while the farmer is left with a farm that now turns poor and miserable. In some stories, though, the Tomte comes back after a while, with his hat in his hand asking to be hired again as the farm's worker. The smart farmer, of course, accepted this and did not leave the Tomte too fancy clothing again, but kept to the normal bowl of porridge and perhaps a bit of cheese and a pair of mittens. The stories about our beloved Tomte is many throughout the history. He is one of the few beings that never, despite how much the church tried to, turned pure evil and lost his protection spirit's place. As long as you kept to his rules, he was there to help, and even in the story when he, kind of like the one where he killed the cow, he still manned up about it and fixed the problem when it clearly was a misunderstanding. He's probably one of our oldest beings that show up in folklore, and he's definitely one of the most loved ones. Thank you so much for listening. Please like, subscribe, comment away. And if you want to know more about Swedish folklore, I have other videos about it. And of course, if you want to support me, I have a Patreon where you can send me a little donation every month. And of course, if you don't want to do it every month in just a single thing, I have a Ko-fi page too. So thank you for listening.